Hello, good evening, welcome. Actually, good morning and welcome. I am Samuel Trapp. This is International Flavor. You are listening to Damn Radio, and I'm damn glad to have you. A lot went on over the weekend. I don't know if you were paying attention or not, but there was plenty going on. So all the talk over this weekend was over Trump's new policy plan, foreign policy. There was an international meeting in Doha. Lots of people, Doha, Qatar, beautiful city. Love it there. And lived there for a little while. It's a great place to be. If you haven't visited, you can visit. Did you know that you can fly you can get on American Airlines, fly from Colombia to Dallas, and from Dallas to Doha? One trip on Qatar Airways, and Qatar is connected with, or Qatar Airways anyway, is connected with American, and it's a great flight. And Qatar is probably the number one or number two airline on the planet. They switch between Emirates Air and Qatar Airways. All their planes are brand new. Their food is fantastic. The flight attendants are extremely nice. It's not like getting on American Airlines most of the places and getting treated like a piece of dog meat. You know, they just don't treat you well here in America. They do not. But if you take an international airline like Qatar Airways, Arab Emirates, or Turkish Airlines is always really good. In fact, Aeroflot is very nice. You know, taking Aeroflot is a good way to go, and that's they treat you well. They just treat you well. Here, it's like you're a burden to them. You know what I mean? And at any rate, I wanted to talk some about that international forum, about the Trump plan, because the world shifted dramatically in Doha, I believe. Anyone paying attention felt the ground move. You don't need a political science degree. You don't need a Pentagon clearance to understand what is happening. All you had to do was watch the way the room reacted to the people that spoke. You had Donald Trump's foreign policy vision laid out with clarity that nobody expected from Washington. You had his son explaining the world America is actually living in instead of the fantasy land the State Department prefers. You had Tucker Carlson doing what American journalists gave up doing 20 years ago. You had Hillary Clinton delivering a sermon that no one believes. And you had Gulf nations, Russia, India, China, and a lot of Africa quietly demonstrating that they no longer take moral direction from the West. Then, just as the dust was settling, Vladimir Putin delivered one of the most strategically honest interviews of his career. He sat with India's press, tore down the myths the West built around him, brick by brick. For anybody that was listening, the message, the unified message, was simple. The unipolar world of globalists is dead, and the people who killed it are pretending they don't see it. Trump's foreign policy document wasn't the ramblings of a man trying to sound tough. It was a blueprint, a new doctrine, a flat statement that the United States cannot afford to continue playing world school teacher while its own foundation rots. It wasn't written in a diplomatic fog or a bureaucratic gibberish. It was written in plain English. Intentionally so, because I believe Trump is not speaking to the State Department. He is speaking to the American people. If you haven't read this, you probably should. It's out there on the internet. And to the governments around the world who are tired of America using democracy as a pretext for bombing people. He laid out the real threat: losing energy advantage, losing industrial base, losing intelligence edge, losing the borders that define the country of America in the first place. There's nothing radical in that. It's what every nation on earth already believes about itself. The only radical thing was that an American president finally said it. And when Trump Jr. stood up in Doha, well, actually he was sitting, I think, and talked about a 3-year window to reset global discourse, he wasn't joking. He wasn't performing. He was acknowledging reality. America is not atop the mountain giving orders anymore. It's at a table with competitors who have out-strategized America, out-produced it, out-negotiated it, and most importantly, outlasted their own patience for America's endless wars. Trump Jr. looked at a room of Gulf officials, CEOs, diplomats, media figures, and said what half of Washington knows, I say all of Washington knows, really, but they refuse to say it either way. America has no moral authority left to squander, to waste. If it wants to be taken seriously again, it will have to rebuild itself. And the audience understood this. They were not naive people. Most of us are not. These are nations that have lived under American lectures for 30 years, 50, and decided they're not interested in more sermons. Meanwhile, in Russia, Solovyov, the guy I like to listen to, and other analysts were watching all of these events with a sort of amused realism that's been perfected by the Russian global, let's call it the Russian political class. They don't see Trump Jr. as a loose cannon or some pampered rich kid taking the temperature of a world, deciding whether America under Trump is a predictable partner or a destabilizing echo of the Biden administration. They recognize that Trump's team, unlike Washington's permanent class, understands energy flow, understands industrial policy, and understands capital shortage. They also believe that the role of the Gulf in the next technological century is quite a bit larger than what they're pumping out in Washington think tanks or New York. They understand something else also. Trump is the first American president who is not trying to resurrect the globalist American empire. I'm starting to believe it after reading his foreign policy, foreign security statement. He's trying to rescue America from the empire's remains, from all the crap that we've done over the last 50 years. And that brings us to Tucker Carlson, who was also there. And he delivered one of the most devastating interviews in American foreign policy history. He sat across from Qatar's foreign minister and unraveled 20, 30 years of lies and professional gaslighting. He asked the question no U.S. network would ever allow out of a producer's mouth. Here's the question. Isn't it true that the United States and Israel asked you to host Hamas? And when Qatar said yes, no hesitation, no spin, no winks. They said it plainly. The narrative the West has been feeding the public about Qatar funding terror collapsed in a 5-second interview. Then Tucker asked about Israel bombing Doha during negotiations, and Qatar confirmed that too, and confirmed that Trump demanded Israel apologize. Think about that. An American president told Israel, the supposed untouchable partner, to apologize to an Arab nation. Seriously, think about that. Nothing like that has happened any time in modern diplomacy. That alone should have blown up the entire premise of American Middle East policy if the media had any integrity. So then comes Hillary Clinton, on the other hand. She goes into Doha. I don't know how she got invited, truthfully, but she was there and she was being interviewed, and she's stuck in 1998. She recited the same old tired crap. She compared Saddam Hussein to the current events in the Middle East. Good versus evil, once more weapons, more intervention by the U.S., more escalation, and wants to talk about our moral superiority. The room did listen, but nobody believed her, and everybody knew it. The Gulf nations have lived through the consequences of American assertiveness. They saw Iraq collapse Libya, burn. Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Gaza. They don't need a lecture from the architect of at least half of those disasters. She spoke the language of the unipolar world, again, in a room where the unipolar world no longer exists. The audience, they didn't listen. They were not convinced. Well, they may have listened, but they certainly weren't convinced. And the age of bowing to Washington's brand of morality has over. I mean, if this showed it, this is it. Doha revealed something else the press will never admit. Zelensky was not invited. That was huge. The world is done performing emotional theater for Ukraine. Doha was for nations shaping the future, not nations begging for weapons and scolding the donors of those weapons. Zelensky's absence says everything you need to know about that. The conflict in Ukraine is no longer a global moral crusade. It is a European burden, a NATO failure, and an American political liability. The Gulf sees that, Asia sees that, Africa sees that, Russia sees that. The only people pretending otherwise are in America. They're the ones who built their careers, like Hillary Clinton, on the illusion of American superiority. The Ukraine is the center of world politics right now. That brings us to Putin's interview in India. And clearest, most unfiltered articulation of Russia's worldview since 2007 when he spoke at the Munich World Conference. He didn't dodge a single accusation. He didn't deflect. It was a great interview. He didn't sugarcoat. It was an hour and a half long by Indian press, by the way. He confronted every Western talking point directly. Are you trying to rebuild the Soviet Union? No, because it's impossible, undesirable, and stupid. Are you an imperialist? No. And the people asking that question are the ones who invaded Iraq and destroyed Libya. Are you obsessed with restoring lost Russian glory? No. I'm running a modern state that has no interest in absorbing populations that do not want to be absorbed. Do you want Ukraine? Take it over? No, but I will not allow NATO to set up missile bases on my border or turn Ukraine into a military colony pointed at Moscow. Like Poland, like the the Baltic states. He explained the history of the region in the way an adult explains things to a child. Calmly, factually, no apologies. Kievan Rus was the origin of both modern Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian lands fell under Lithuania and Poland for centuries. They rejoined Russia by request, by the way, not by conquest. Language, religion, culture have been intertwined for 1,000 years. This is not myth. This is history. And when the interviewer asked about civilians shocked by Russia's actions, Putin asked the only question that mattered. Shocked by what? He said. Who was it that bombed Donetsk for 8 years when nobody said a word in the West? Who banned the Russian language, he asked. Who shelled schools and homes in the Donbass? It was not Russia. This war didn't begin in 2022, he said. It began in 2014. And the West pretended not to notice because admitting that would reveal who really destabilized the region. Putin's discussion of NATO was pretty much equally blunt. Security cannot be built at another nation's expense. Ukraine can choose its own path, but not if that path puts NATO missiles 5 minutes from Moscow. The U.S. wouldn't tolerate Russian missiles in Mexico, and everybody knows it. The difference is that Russia's honest about its red lines while the West pretends it has none. He emphasized something else Western audiences never hear. Russia doesn't demand special treatment, only that Washington, when they make their promises, that those promises are honored. NATO promised not to expand eastward many, many times. It did so anyway. The West broke security architecture and then blamed Russia for responding to the wreckage America and company were creating. Putin's remarks in India could not have been more strategically important. especially about India itself. He outlined a partnership built on ideology, not on desperation, and on decades of trust. Are you aware that Russia and India have been partners for a very long time, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union? Russia is investing in India's refining capacity long before it has been, way before the start of the Ukraine conflict. Russia supplies energy to India, defense technology, nuclear cooperation, and economic opportunity with no moral conditioning. He calls Modi his friend, and he meant it. India is not a pawn to Russia. It is a peer, a partner, a civilizational power with its own destiny. And the West really hates this because we can't control it. He was met on the red carpet by Modi, and that never happens. Modi does not meet people at the airport, but he met Putin when he got off his plane. He was on the tarmac with a red carpet rolled out. Russia and India share something deeper than trade. He was there for 2 days, the same time this Doha thing was going on. The release of this Trump plan, it came out in late November, but people have only been talking about it for the last few days, this Trump security plan. Basically, Russia and India share an understanding, real sovereignty for each other. They want to pick things, not the American version, which means you're free as long as you do what we want. You're a sovereign, but only when you agree with our globalists. India and Russia reject that model, as you can tell, from this weekend. It was a pretty big deal. Both nations have been carved up, manipulated, colonized, pressured, lectured, and threatened for generations. Both emerged from that experience with the same conclusion: never again. That is why India buys Russian oil, Russian weapons, Russian reactors, and has Russian engineers everywhere. And they do this without hesitation. Why? It's not because Russia is cheap. It's because Russia doesn't interfere in India's internal affairs. That's what's happening. Russia doesn't tell India what to think about gender policy, carbon tax, digital censorship, Ukraine, Gaza, the Taliban, name it, or whatever the latest Western moral crusade is. They don't accept those lectures. China, Russia, India, and many, many others no longer will do it, and that was made clear here. Russia treats India like an equal. The West treats India like a rebellious teenager. Which one would you prefer? Which one does India prefer? So in the interview that Putin was asked why Russia recognized the Taliban, and Putin responded pretty clearly: Afghanistan has suffered decades of war. Governments have come and gone, and whether the West likes it or not, the Taliban controls the territory and are fighting terrorism inside it. And they're doing it more effectively than the Western installed regimes ever did. He doesn't endorse them. Who would? He doesn't whitewash them. He simply states a reality. Russia does not have the right to dictate Afghanistan's internal affairs. Neither does America, by the way. Russia engages with a government that exists, not the one the State Department wishes existed. India understands this also. India hates instability on its own doorstep, and Russia is one of the few global powers capable of helping maintain balance in the region without exporting its own ideology. That's a big point, people. We're trying to force another country to think like you do, like we're doing in Venezuela, by the way. I still disagree with that, but it seems to have calmed down a little bit. But Putin's definition of terrorism is another strategic clarity moment. Terrorism is not defined by slogans, flags, or political motives. Terrorism is defined by the method you use. If you are harming civilians, You are not a freedom fighter. You are a criminal. And that is terrorism. The West blurs this line, and it supports rebels in one country, terrorists, while condemning identical rebels in another country, depending on whose side the rebels are on. This is historic, and Putin said it flat out in his interview. It was a great interview. Russia doesn't play that game, and they really don't. India doesn't play that game. Neither does China. Those two nations understand the price of terrorism in blood, not in editorials. When he was asked about NATO expansion, he explained the principle at the heart of every stable security system. One nation's safety cannot come at the expense of another's. This is not an invention of Putin or of Russia. It's the foundation of the Helsinki Accords, European declarations. NATO has broken all of them. For 30 years, Russia has been warning that surrounding it with U.S.-controlled military infrastructure is aggression. Washington ignored that. Not because they didn't believe Russia, because obviously they did, but they didn't believe that Russia had the strength to respond to them, and the West miscalculated. They bet that Russia would complain and do nothing like they had for many years. Instead, Russia defended its own red lines, and now the West claims it was blindsided by a war it spent years provoking. Putin pointed out something else Western journalists never mention. Russia has never demanded that Ukraine become a satellite state. Russia has never demanded control over Ukrainian politics. Russia has never demanded the right to appoint Ukrainian officials or dictate domestic affairs. Russia demanded only one thing: do not let NATO use Ukraine as a forward operating base. They were consistent about it. They said it all the time. This is a demand that every major power would have made. The United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine to justify military action in the entire Western Hemisphere. China demands the same regarding Taiwan. India demands the same thing regarding its own borders. Only Russia is told that defending its security is illegitimate. So when he was being interviewed, he also brought up civilians in eastern Ukraine shocked by the war, and Putin dismantled that framework immediately. Shocked by what? He said. By Russia responding after 8 years of shelling in the Donbass? By Russia intervening after the Minsk agreements 1 and 2 were both deliberately sabotaged by the West? By Russia stepping in after the Ukrainian government banned the Russian language, targeted ethnic Russians, and deployed ultranationalist battalions in the Donbass? The West expects everybody to forget that Ukraine's own president admitted on camera that he never intended to implement Minsk. If you haven't seen that, you should go check that out. He was even laughing about it. He goes, we never intended to do that, but they signed it anyway. The entire negotiation process was a stall tactic, according to him, according to Germany, according to France, and it was used to arm Ukraine for war. Russia remembers this. Lugansk, Donetsk, remember this. The West pretends that it didn't happen, though. And Putin explained that in his interview. His explanation was not nostalgic. It was evidence. Western analysts call it a myth because they either don't understand Eastern European history or they hope their audiences don't. I do. If you've ever been over there, I went to Brest. Oh, my God. What a place. And watching, the fortress there was unbelievable, overrun for hundreds of years, and it was quite the history lesson. Well, not that I didn't know most of it anyway, but boy, that entire area was run over, including all of Ukraine. It's unbelievable and very interesting to see that stuff in reality, checking out history as it occurred. Ukraine was never a single unified state, never, until the Soviets assembled it, created Ukraine, pretending it's an ancient sovereign nation of its own, threatened by Russian imperialism, is a fairy tale. And it's created for Western audiences, not a historic reality. When Putin explained where the ancient Rus came from, where the language evolved, how the land shifted, and why Ukraine is not a modern, simple victim, but a complicated, very complicated historical region, he was trying to give a context that the West refuses to provide. But I do. He did. The most devastating part of his interview was not his answer about Ukraine. It was what he said about India. He doesn't speak like a man hoping for diplomatic cover. He speaks like a leader, confident that Russia's future lies not in begging the West for acceptance, but in partnering with nations that actually matter. Russia, China, India, all the entire global South. He described India's development as colossal, and it is. It is unbelievably fast growing right now. He talked about Modi as his friend. He talked about energy, defense, nuclear cooperation, industrial growth, all as partners, not as patron and client like the West does. India wants predictability. Russia can deliver it, and they have for quite a few years. India wants sovereignty, and Russia respects that. India wants multipolarity, and Russia is building it. And Trump's state plan acknowledged this. This is why Western pressure campaigns have been failing for years. The rest of the world understands something fundamental about a new global order. Nations outside the West now are thinking for themselves. They aren't taking orders. They don't fear sanctions the way they used to. They don't measure morality by what CNN says is moral. They measure it by their own self-interests, stability, and sovereignty. And Doha and Putin's interview shows and confirms this for everybody. And the Palestinians are not the only ones whose tragedy exposes Western hypocrisy. Wait until Venezuela. You want to see some hypocrisy? Check out Venezuela. Ukraine exposes it. Gaza exposes it. Syria, Libya, Yemen, they all expose this. The West talks about a rules-based order, but the rest of the world sees a pattern. There are rules for everybody else and loopholes for the West to do what they want. When Qatar's foreign minister said on camera that Qatar would not rebuild Gaza because we did not destroy it, he wasn't taking a stand. He was pointing out the hypocrisy of demanding Russian assets to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction while refusing to demand that Israel pay for Gaza's. That's a big deal. That was in the Tucker Carlson interview. Tucker caught it instantly. The audience caught it instantly. Hillary Clinton and the globalists pretend not to notice this. And what made Doha extraordinary was not the content of the speeches, it was the tone, just about everywhere. It was the way the world responded to American voices versus everyone else. When Hillary Clinton spoke, the reaction was respectful but distant. When Donald Trump Jr. spoke, the reaction was curious, engaged, and alert. And when Tucker spoke, the reaction was electric. And when Putin spoke in India, the reaction across the global South was recognition. Not agreement with everything, but recognition that the world's center of gravity has changed. I wanted to play for you the at least the Trump Jr. interview. I think we have time for it. And to get to all of my stuff, I want to get to my history here and see if I can find it. It's only about 8 minutes. And here, let me see if I can tee this up correctly. Because there was he was introduced, and I got to get to the spot that I wish to be. Damn it. It's not letting me. There we go. And there were some pretty good moments in here. Let's see where we start. I'm not positive where this is starting. Let me see if I can put the the speaking on. Let's see. There were two people there, and they were talking about the Elon Musk $150 million fine that the EU gave him. Meanwhile, in Germany, Friedrich Merz has filed 5,000 plus charges against people who badmouthed him on social media. That's freedom of speech, isn't it? And they were talking about that a little bit. This whole interview, damn it, I don't want this one. I want the one that's only 8 minutes long in the history here. I got to go to my history to find it because, no, that one's 30 minutes. But there were several versions of this that came out, and I can't find it. Let me do a quick search for it while I babble here for a minute. So if you type in Trump Jr Doha, you get quite a few that come up, and here's one. Here it is. This one's only 9 minutes, and so I think we're going to get to where he's supposed to be. So let us listen to this and see what we come up with. Ukraine corruption is out of control and all of that. I mean, he was on a roll. That is for sure. So here's some Donald Trump Jr. in Doha. And he tore into Zelensky. So listen up here.
The last decade, but he got there by being a builder, so he understands how to do that. I do also know, though, that he understands that the American public isn't going to do what they used to do for years, where we're just going to be the big dumb guy with the checkbook and we're going to cover all of the world's problems and no one else has to do their part. I think he can be, the greatest construction manager in the history of the world, but no one in America wants to bear the entire responsibility of that. That's happened for far too long. Everyone has their ideas. Everyone wants to do X, Y, Z. When it comes to actually writing a check and breaking out their own checkbook, well, we're not interested in that. That changes things. The American public doesn't have the appetite to fund everything for everyone all over the world with no direct benefit to themselves. So I think he can be the manager that brings that together, but everyone's going to actually have to step up and do their part and not just leave it to the United States to cover everything.
Omid, do you think that the private sector has a role to play when it comes to, say, the reconstruction of Gaza?
I'm sure. I mean, I think that there'll probably be an opportunity for the private sector, but also there'll be governments that step up and, to help solve this issue. I mean, again, we're here as business people, and our focus is mostly in the United States, though.
I want to focus on Ukraine because, of course, as you say, you're both here in the capacity of business leaders, but you've also been instrumental in shaping the message of the administration. You talked about Europeans, and Europeans are concerned that Ukraine is going to be abandoned. Are those fears valid?
I don't think Ukraine is going to be abandoned, but I think for years, again, it was the same thing as the last answer, which is, well, we want to attack Russia. We want to do this. Well, when it comes to actually writing a check ourselves, no, the U.S. is going to do it. The American public doesn't have an appetite for that. Since the invasion of Ukraine, I heard major leaders, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate in the United States, saying, it's the #1 issue for Republicans in the United States. And I say, that's weird. I speak to Republicans all over the country every day, probably far more than Mitch has ever spoken to, despite his 379-year career in politics. I did that on a weekly basis, and I surveyed people at every talk I did. It got to the point where it was probably well over 200,000 Americans that I spoke to directly. And I'd be in a room like this, and I'd ask, is Russia-Ukraine a top 3 issue for anyone in the room? Nothing. Is it a top 10 issue for anyone in the room? I think I got 3 people that once said it was a top 10 issue. 3 out of hundreds surveyed, hundreds of thousands, every weekend for 2 years, till basically through the campaign. One person misunderstood the question. He thought it was a double negative. One person was actually from Kiev, so he was like, it was a big deal for him. And the other person was, I think on the board of Raytheon. So there was no appetite for that, but that didn't stop a Republican Party from saying it's the number one issue. It's not, and we actually have to listen to the will of those people. So we want peace, we want to stop the death, but I even saw that yesterday where, on this very stage, what was the idea for Europe, who is on the border of Ukraine, who has much more at stake if this happens? Well, our plan is to win economically when pressed on the issue. How are you going to do that? Well, we're just going to wait for Russia to go bankrupt. That's not a plan. That's not an idea. The gentleman from Spain was a lovely guy. I saw him last night later on at the forum, but Spain was putting in 2.2% rather than the 5% required by NATO, because my father actually wanted people who are the biggest stakeholders to get into the game. Well, we feel that our 2.2% is being utilized more efficiently, and therefore that's not an answer. That's not a solution. And again, I understand why they are there, because America has set a precedent for decades that they'll just write the check. But if the will of the people isn't there, everyone needs to step up. Everyone has to do their share. And that includes what's happening here in the Middle East. If we do that collectively, we can get to an answer. But if we default to the old ways of America's just going to be the big idiot with a checkbook, that's not going to work. That's not going to happen. And you saw what happened. When my father starts threatening they're going to pull out, we're not going to do this anymore, because he's listening to the people that elected him to office.
Big idiot with a checkbook. I love that line. When he tears apart Ukraine, it gets even better. So we're going to continue listening to this because I like it.
The whole world, this is outrageous. It's not outrageous. It's common sense. When we're bombing drug boats in the Caribbean, people who are literally bringing in fentanyl to America, something that kills 100,000 Americans a year. Okay, just for perspective, that's 2 Vietnam Wars a year in America.
This I don't like. You can't justify it this way. You still need to have some sort of due process, some sort of tribunal, something. And so I disagree with this part.
The neocon establishment, the Democrats, how dare you do this? I mean, that's a far greater, clear and present danger to the United States than anything going on in Ukraine and Russia.
That doesn't mean you don't give people some kind of a tribunal.
And yet they're against it. Think of the insanity of that. So my father has a common sense approach to everything. That's because rather than being a lifelong bureaucrat who's never actually done anything in the real world, he has, and he understands what that means, and we have to act accordingly.
Yeah, so I just want to say one thing on that. Going back to the gentlelady that spoke yesterday, I think she had a Freudian slip, at least I hope it was one, where she talked about what we did to the Russians in Afghanistan. That's not a great comp, by the way. Okay, that's a horrible comp. What we were doing, we're funding a mujahideen that create radicalization in that country, and we know what we reaped after that. I'm a business person, I look at this. We've spent almost $300 billion over there, and now we find out that Zelensky's number 2 is under investigation for corruption. Where's the audit of where any of that money went? We should be asking those questions. We have over 300,000 people dead. It doesn't make sense as the United States to have enemies.
It's a lot more than that, so he's incorrect on that.
In both Russia, China, and then also add Iran in there. So from a strategic standpoint, again, speaking as a private citizen, my sense is you should act as a reverse Kissinger, neutralize the Russians, and then focus on the real threat that nobody seems to want to talk about except his dad, who started the conversation, that China is the one that you need to...
This is Omad Malik, one of his partners.
...to focus on.
One of the most amazing things I got to witness, I was this summer with my beautiful girlfriend Bettina in Monaco. And we were driving around.
Here it comes. This is a huge takedown on Ukraine.
And on an average day, 50% of the supercars, the Bugattis, the Ferraris, this, all had Ukrainian plates. Do we think that was actually earned in Ukraine? I'd been to Ukraine 20 years ago. It wasn't like there was a plethora of wealth there. And yet, you see the number 2 there getting arrested for stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. You hear all the rumors about what's going on. When I see every license plate on a supercar in Monaco being Bugattis, the rich fled. They let what they believed to be the peasant class fight these wars. And there was no incentive to stop, because as long as the money train was coming and they were stealing it and no one was auditing anything, the leaders, the decision makers, there was no reason for them to ever come to peace. no different than Putin. It wasn't the son of oligarchs that were fighting these wars. It's someone from Siberia that they're sending there. And he utilized the war to rebuild his manufacturing base. It was very clear that the sanctions that we put on did nothing to actually help. All it did was jack up the price of oil, which allowed him to basically pay for the war with the delta between the two while building up his manufacturing base. There was no incentive for anyone to ever get to the table. Zelensky knew he wouldn't win another election again, and they were continuing to steal. Putin was building up his manufacturing base, and all we had in the wake was millions of young men dying for nothing.
I mean, obviously, Ukraine has a massive corruption issue, and as you say,
it was a far more corrupt country than Russia, as delegated by the United States government prior to this war. But then, because of the war, and because he's one of the great marketers of all time, Zelensky became a borderline deity, especially to the left, where he could do no wrong. He was beyond reproach. Years of corruption, years of graft and theft on a world stage that everyone in this room knew was happening, was totally absolved. And it's ridiculous. We're not dealing in reality.
But is your hunch that President Trump is going to walk away?
I think he may. What's good about my father and what's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he's not predictable, he's not following the playbook of every clown who's, again, been a bureaucrat for decades, you don't know. And so that forces everyone to actually deal in an intellectually honest capacity, which has not happened in far too long.
I want to ask you about Elon Musk, because...
Let's not go. Well, you know what, though? It does have something to do with freedom of speech. So we'll finish this out. There's only like 20 seconds left. Let's see if he puts a quick answer in there. I think it might, but I don't want to go too much further. I have more to cover.
Because, of course, your company, 1789, deeply invested in many of Elon's companies. I mean, speaking of mediation, have you guys played a role in, we've seen the relationship.
This video doesn't get to it. It's basically over. But that showed how Trump sees the future. How'd you like that part about the corruption in Ukraine? How'd you like that part about nobody ever knows what my dad's gonna do? I love that. Nobody knows. This is why Trump's foreign policy is resonating globally. Trump isn't promising the world freedom. He's promising consistency. You know, I've been skeptical, let's call it, about the old Trumpster for quite a while. I've been skeptical. On international, I like most of what he's done nationally. I'm not a huge Trumper. You know, I was definitely not a Biden, definitely not a Harris. You know, I could never justify either of those morons, you know, further again. And Trump, like his son said here, they're trying to run America like a business. Do I agree with everything? Absolutely not. But, you know, this consistency promise, you know, a lot of the stuff that's come out about Modi, about Xi Jinping, about Putin, you know what is there that America does not have? And it's extremely hard to keep because you change direction every 4 years, is consistency, is straight beliefs, not coming in every 4 years and tearing up not only America, but the entire world because you disagree with your predecessor. It's nonsense, and I don't like it. The contrast between Trump's realism and Hillary's, you know, nostalgic, oh gee, let's go back to the, you know, the new world order was quite sharp. Hillary talked like somebody trying to rewind the VCR back to 1995. And Trump Jr. talks like somebody who knows that beta and VCR, VHS snapped years ago. All the tapes are destroyed. Tucker talks like somebody tired of being lied to by his government. Putin talks like somebody building the next 50 years of global policy. And the world is reacting. The future will not be decided by the European Union, the United Nations, or more importantly, the U.S. State Department. It'll be decided by energy states, manufacturing states, technology states, and civilization states. Russia, China, India, the Gulf, and whichever Western nations wake up first and join the new reality instead of resisting it. Do you remember me telling you about the interview I did in Kazan last year and the girl running around with the picture of Putin and what I had said at that time? And I think it will bear out is, it was the BRICS conference. And she said, if you could ask Putin one question, what would you ask? And she made, and this is on Russian TV. I looked at him at the picture and I said, well, could we join BRICS? America join BRICS in 10 years? Could we join? Are we part of it? We wouldn't let Russia join NATO, but could we join BRICS? Working together with people is a hell of a lot different than dictating to them. That's not diplomacy. That's dictatorial stuff, and the world's tired of it. Doha made this clear. Putin confirmed it. The West and Hillary Clinton can keep pretending it's the 90s, but the rest of the world has moved on. Perhaps the clearest sign that the world has moved on is not in the speeches of Doha or even in Putin's interview, but in the silence of Zelensky. Where'd he go? 2 years ago, any major meeting, any forum would have shoved him onto the main stage, surrounded him with flags and Ukrainian blue and yellow everywhere, violins, tears, and then they would have declared that he was the spirit of democracy. He's resisting tyranny. Now, he didn't even get an invitation. There was no spotlight and no interest. The world is exhausted by Ukraine's endless demands, by Western governments pretending that this is a war between good and evil, instead of a geopolitical struggle that was unleashed by NATO expansion. And the 2014 coup in Ukraine. Even those who still support Ukraine privately admit the war is unwinnable. The corruption is bottomless, and the Western narrative has collapsed under its own contradictions. Doha and the people there treated Ukraine exactly the way global powers treat regional conflict, polite indifference. And that is what terrifies the Western establishment, especially the military-industrial complex. They know that once the emotional manipulation surrounding Ukraine has evaporated, all that remains is the cold truth. Europe has dragged itself into a war that it cannot win. American money funded a war that we can't explain. And Russia walked into a war it spent 8 years preparing for while the West was busy debating pronouns and social media censorship. The longer the war goes on, and the more ground Russia takes, which has been quite a bit, even over the weekend, the more obvious this imbalance becomes. Trump Jr. talking about all the Bugattis and all the foreign cars, that's true in Miami as well. There are plenty of Ukrainians running around with Ukrainian license plates that were funded by our money, and they get rich from it, and then they leave the country. That's how it works. Those are the ones who have been successful, and they get out. They don't want to live in Ukraine. That's destroyed. They want to live elsewhere and show off all the money that they have corruptly lifted from the government of Ukraine. Well, the U.S. government. From us, basically. The countries that were in Doha weren't interested in symbolism. They're interested in results. Trump's foreign policy document, which I've read, offers results. Cut unnecessary war. He was a little more silent about Venezuela, though. Rebuild American industry. Restore America's energy dominance, and negotiate from a position of strength instead of fantasy. Trump Jr. talked about this, acknowledged multipolarity, stopped pretending Europe defines global morality, and recognizes that America's decline is not inevitable if America changes course. Tucker offered results also. Hypocrisies that have poisoned U.S. credibility for decades I agree. Qatar offers results. Negotiate with whoever controls reality, not whoever writes the press releases, which is American foreign policy. It has been for years. Russia offers results. Mutually beneficial trade programs, military partnerships, and energy cooperation without interfering in the ideology of the country. India offers results, its own stability, its own development, and its own vision of the future. No longer dependent on Western permission to do something. You know what one of the biggest ironies is that the only people who didn't offer results are the ones who claim to defend the old rules-based order. Why Hillary Clinton was ever on the stage, I'll never understand. I'd play some, but it's not worth it. But she did talk about restoring the world that America used to run. But the world she's talking about doesn't exist anymore. She warned about dictators taking over the planet, but the crowd listening to her understands perfectly well that the only country invading nations for the past 25 years wasn't Russia. It was America. And she warns about disinformation. But the same American establishment she represents lies about weapons of mass destruction, lied about Libya, lied about Syria, lied about Afghanistan, lied about NSA surveillance, lied about Ukraine corruption, and lied about Gaza. So nobody was impressed by her appearance and all these things because she was the architect of at least half of that crap. And something else in Doha was undeniable. Qatar is the new Switzerland. Not the Switzerland of the old world, the one that hid bank accounts and avoided war, but the Switzerland of global mediation, neutrality, and power. Remember that? When it used to be Switzerland? The difference? Switzerland collapsed under Western pressure and abandoned neutrality to please Brussels and Washington. Qatar has done the opposite. Despite years of U.S. senators smearing them as terrorism sponsors, despite relentless Western media propaganda, despite Israeli pressure, Qatar has stood firm and become a diplomatic backbone of the Middle East. I'd love to have a house there. The place is awesome. They hosted Hamas at the U.S. and Israeli requests. They brokered ceasefires. They facilitated hostage releases. They mediated energy deals. They built some of the Western relationships that America relies upon, but nobody acknowledges. And Tucker's interview was actually real. If you get a chance, you should watch that. Qatar wasn't acting as an extension of Washington, which Clinton was trying to force. They acted as a sovereign power, making their own sovereign decisions, and the West doesn't like that. The West only likes mediation when it controls the mediator. When Qatar proved it can't be controlled, the West turned to smearing Qatar, but Doha doesn't care. They're wealthy, stable, and influential. They're at the center of all global energy. They're center of AI expansion, infrastructure finance, Middle Eastern diplomacy. They're positioned between China's Belt and Road Initiative, between Russia's energy network, and India's manufacturing rise. They're also involved in Africa's emerging consumer markets. That's why Doha is so different. They don't have arrogance, maybe a little, but they're very confident. What you see in Doha was the emergence of a political culture that does not depend on Western approval. That's why this is terrifying to the West. For decades, Western governments could destroy careers, topple governments, silence dissent through narrative alone. That era, we hope, is over. It appears to be on an international stage, but at home they're still doing it. When the Gulf, Russia, India, and China now speak, the West cannot censor them. When Qatar broadcasts all of its interviews, the West can't shadow ban them, can't put them at the back, can't tell YouTube don't run them. When Tucker speaks from Doha instead of from Fox News, the West cannot fire him. They can't get rid of him. The American media establishment is no longer the gatekeeper of the truth, what they claim is the truth. Doha demonstrated that the West lost something far more important than geopolitical dominance. It lost the narrative. Think about that. Narrative dominance is what held the unipolar world together. Globalism held it together by narrative. The idea that the West decides who the villains are, who the heroes are, who gets so-called democracy, and who gets sanctions, who gets invaded, who gets lectured, who gets weapons, who gets starvations, all of that has evaporated, basically since the Trump foreign policy document, this past weekend. Isn't that crazy? The people in Doha weren't asking for permission. They didn't defer. They didn't flatter. They spoke like equals because that's what they are. And Russia-India relationship has sealed this reality. Putin's interview was showing a leader that understands his own country's interests and understands the trajectory of global power. He wasn't begging India for support. He acknowledged India's rise as a pillar of global stability. He didn't lecture India about democracy. He praised its development. He doesn't treat India like a colony. He treats it like a partner. Think about that, because that's a big difference. The West's relationship with India is transactional and conditional, but Russia's relationship with them is strategic, powerful, and respectful. When Putin called India's growth colossal, he was describing a geopolitical fact. It is a fact. India is one of the only countries in the world capable of matching China's demographic size, Russia's natural resources, and America's technological potential. India is not a client state. India is not a junior partner. India is not a pawn in someone else's game. They are now, and we helped create it, by the way, a civilizational power set on its own course. And that is exactly why the West is struggling with its rise. It's absolutely true. The West expects loyalty to globalism from India. Russia offers partnership. The West expects ideological alignment. Russia offers cooperation. The West expects India to choose sides. Yeah, remember this? You got to choose a side. You got to pick a side. Russia or Ukraine, Russia or Ukraine. Russia offers India the chance to avoid choosing sides entirely. And India understands that Russia's view of the world aligns far more closely with its own historical experience. Colonialism taught India that Western moralizing is often a mask worn to allow exploitation. Neocolonialism taught India that Western promotion of democracy often leads to chaos. The global financial system taught India that Western control over its capital is a weapon. Russia doesn't carry any of that. Think about that. Another revelation from Putin's interview is how confidently he dismissed accusations thrown at him for years. He didn't behave like a defensive leader overwhelmed by pressure. He behaves like a man whose country has weathered every sanction, every diplomatic assault, every propaganda blitz, and it came out stronger. Russia has not collapsed. Russia isn't begging. Russia didn't compromise. Russia has redirected its trade, rebuilt its manufacturing base. You heard Trump Jr. talking about that. Expanded its military production, deepened its own alliances. Meanwhile, what's happened in Europe? Europe froze. Inflation has soared. Industries are gone. And American political leadership in Europe has disintegrated. This is why Putin's tone in the India interview matters. He was sounded like a man speaking from a stable platform while watching a dominant Western order unravel. He isn't angry. He isn't flustered. He isn't evasive. He was patient, and the patience shows confidence that a secure country, secure in its future, projects. And that future is not a Western dominated future. It's a multipolar world order. And Doha confirms it. Putin articulated it. The West fears it. And the rest of the world is embracing it. What Doha and the India interview revealed is that the world is finally confident enough to say openly what it has been whispering privately for years. The Western model, globalism, is no longer universal, no longer persuasive, and most importantly, no longer feared. Countries are making decisions of their own, not based on Washington's approval, but based on their own strategic interest, economic benefit, their own cultural identity. And most importantly, they are forming relationships with each other without mediation from the United States. This is what the West has never expected. They assume that once American prestige collapses, the world would fall into chaos. Instead, the world is reorganizing itself peacefully, pragmatically, and without the West at the center. I think that's important to recognize. You know, when I apply all these things that I researched over the weekend, when I take a look at all of the horror story of Ukraine and the haves and the have-nots, all the people, and on the stage, Trump Jr.'s partner, I forget his name, Malik, I think, he said that there were 300,000 dead. It's 1,300,000, closer to that on the Ukrainian side alone. Some of the numbers are still being twisted just a little bit. I think they were prepared for this or uninformed about a couple of primary factors. But I tell you what, it was some interesting conversation. It was, Trump's foreign policy doctrine, actually fits into this new world in a way that no Mitch McConnell, no Lindsey Graham, no establishment politician like Hillary Clinton can explain. Trump doesn't believe America has the divine right to police the globe. At least I didn't catch it. I mean, you should read this document. It's only like 30 pages. It's not really all that long. And it's on the president's website. You can pull down the new internet, the foreign policy document, security document. But he doesn't believe the State Department is the priesthood of international morality. He doesn't believe that the Pentagon's job is to fight wars everywhere except America. He doesn't believe that lecturing sovereign nations produces peace. It seems from reading his doctrine, his policy, that it's pretty simple. America should be strong, wealthy, sovereign, and respected. Not feared, not resented, not overextended. God, I hope this actually works. His document, when I read it, I mean, if you listen to me regularly, you know what I think about Trump's international policy ends. There was an interview with another guy that said, do you think he's gonna abandon Ukraine? And there's $400 million still in the budget. I saw a report this morning in the new Pentagon budget. There's still $400 million in there for Ukraine, which I think is BS, but it's still there. And I've said forever, if he cut off the intelligence and cut off the funding and left it to Europe if they want to, let them do it. I think we're headed that way. I really do, because his foreign policy document said that it's strategically important, quite important, to work with Russia. Trump Jr. talked with a clarity. You tell me he ain't involved with his father? He is. He is. His father often buries, logic and bluster. You know what I mean? He's always attacking somebody, but his son is a lot more direct. And he said America has a narrow window to reset its approach to the world, not by force, but by strategy. He himself said that energy, industry, technology will define the next 50 years. Now, where do you think he got that? That's what BRICS has been saying. BRICS has been saying this in their conferences. Trump Jr. also said that nations with cheap energy and strong industrial bases will dominate the AI era, which is upon us. He said that America has to rebuild what it allowed to be outsourced to India and China and dismantled, and Mexico too, by the way. All of the Gulf, everybody I really wish I could have been in Doha for this. It would have been fantastic. And the Gulf understands this because they're sitting on energy resources that are powering the AI revolution. Russia understands this because it is one of the only countries with the resources and the scientific base to compete on the world stage. Remember me going through several weeks ago the number of engineers that come from Russian schools versus American, the number that come from India and China, all these engineering is the wave of the future, and America hasn't done anything to encourage it. India understands all of this because India has been positioning itself as the world's next manufacturing and technological superpower. They might even, and they have the ability to go to compete with China because of the number of people. India is the largest country in the world, 1.48 billion compared to China's 1.44 billion or something like that. And they're both growing. They aren't shrinking like the rest of the world where birth rates are down. America under Trump is, at least his document that he put out shows that we could work with those nations mutually, realistically, respectfully. I think India and China standing up to Trump and saying, not so fast, Ghost Rider, we are going to do what we think is best for us. That's not America under Biden or Clinton. He has to treat these nations not as children needing supervision, but as equals. That difference in Trump defines almost everything. The West cannot understand why the global South gravitates toward leaders like Trump or Putin or Modi instead of the intellectuals of the Atlantic Council, instead of the Hillary Clintons of the world. The answer is simple, because the polished intellectual lecturers destroyed more than half of the world. Pragmatic nationalists have built their own. Hillary Clinton in Doha was symbolic. Like a ghost from the past, from the unipolar era that's been trying to haunt a room that no longer believes in ghosts. She warned about dictators, but the audience saw instability created by, quote, democracy. She warned about Russian aggression, but the audience knows who ruined Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan. She warned about disinformation, but the audience has watched Western media manipulate every global conflict for more than 30 years. She warned that Trump would weaken America. That was funny. But the audience knows America is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. And by the way, collapsing, I mean as a world dominating the world, okay? And I think that Trump's foreign policy was the first acknowledgement that we need to start working as partners, excuse me, Hillary Clinton was speaking in a language the world no longer uses. Excuse me. The rest of the world has simply moved on. Tucker's interview with Qatar's foreign minister demonstrated the new communication dynamic in a multipolar age. Tucker Carlson is doing some extremely important things, friends and neighbors. Excuse me. Instead of sanitized press conferences, you get a blunt American journalist asking direct questions of a sovereign Gulf leader. It's a great interview. Should listen to it. It's on the internet. Instead of evasive diplomatic answers, you had transparent response that contradict years of Western political messaging. It's crazy. Russia-India's relationship with Putin's interview changed a lot of stuff. Putin emphasized that Russia's energy relationship with India has nothing to do with Ukraine. Why are we discussing Ukraine when I have an energy relationship with India? It predates this conflict by decades. Decades, Russia has been working with India. Russian companies have invested heavily in India's refining infrastructure. India refines Russian oil and has been for a long time, and exported the products to Europe. Ironically, it makes Europe more dependent on Russian hydrocarbon, even while pretending to impose sanctions. Putin discussed this without gloating. He didn't need to. The absurdity of Western sanctions speaks for itself. I've been saying that. Anybody who knows anything's been saying that for a long time. Nuclear cooperation has been going on for decades. New agreements are already in motion. This is a big red flag for the West because nuclear partnerships create long-term alignment. At least they have a 60-year contract. 60 years. Crazy stuff. For decades, the West has relied on its ability to define reality for the rest of the world. It didn't matter what actually happened in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Serbia, Ukraine, World Trade Center. What mattered was what CNN and Fox News said happened, what the BBC reported, what the New York Times printed, and what the State Department declared untruthfully. The West controlled that framework, controlled the language, controlled the morality. If the West called somebody a dictator, he was one. If the West called a group of freedom fighters, they were heroes. If the West called a war humanitarian, bombs are irrelevant, right? That era ended the moment the rest of the world has gained enough economic and media independence to speak for itself. Frankly, I think it started around the time of COVID. I think that was kind of a reset of everything. It localized many, many things. And it didn't mean, the only place you could get news was from certain sources in the West. There's competition everywhere. I love watching Indian TV. They're pretty blunt. And I like watching Russian TV. Stuff from Al Jazeera that people think, oh, geez, they're a bunch of Muslims. And that doesn't mean they're not saying things that are true. They aren't trying to dictate anything to you. They're just talking about the world as they see it. And that's important. Doha proved that the West no longer owns the global microphone. And they don't. Russia has a media network. I told you about RT going into India and the huge outlay of funds there. China has its own networks. India has its own. The Gulf funds world-class broadcasters that don't talk. None of them talk in any of these places, like a Washington parrot. Weapons of mass destruction, everyone, is all you ever heard, right? African nations communicate with each other directly. Latin America even has alternatives. Once narrative, and that's one of the biggest things in Trump's foreign policy document. He is saying that we need to focus on the Western Hemisphere and quit doing stuff all over the world. That's why South America is important to him. But I still think he needs to do it more as partnerships instead of this forcing what's going on. He's creating a new war closer to home. I think he's doing it for the benefit of the Mitch McConnells of the world. You know, those morons need to be kicked out. So once the narrative monopoly has disappeared, which it almost has, Western credibility evaporated right with it because everybody knows that the West lied for years. The truth was simple. The West's power has never been based on economics or military strength. It's based on the mythology of those two things. When the mythology broke, so did the empire. This is why Hillary Clinton sounded so hollow and old in Doha. She came with the old script, the same old American script. America leads, everybody else has to follow, but the room wasn't following. The room listened to her the way one listens to an elder relative repeat stories from decades ago. Me and my army stories, decades ago. My important contributions to the world happened in the 90s. And Hillary, it's the same thing. Hillary talked about the need for America to be more assertive in Ukraine. Nobody cares about that. The audience understood that assertive means more weapons, more escalation, more instability, not less. She talked about Putin like it was still 2015 and the West believed its own propaganda. She talked about defending democracy as if Ukraine was a democracy and as if the United States hasn't spent the past 25 years destroying nations in the name of democracy. Nobody believed her. You go listen to her. In contrast, every time Tucker Carlson opened his mouth, everybody was listening. Not because he's beloved, but because he was saying things that diplomats and journalists are too cowardly to say. He exposed the contradiction at the heart of Western policies. Nations are punished not for what they do, but for whom they refuse to obey. Isn't that terrible? He asked questions Western journalists refused to ask because the answer would collapse the carefully curated moral hierarchy that justifies constant intervention. Qatar's foreign minister responded without fear because Qatar understands something crucial as well. This is important. The West needs Qatar far more than Qatar needs the West. Think about that. Qatar is not alone. Saudi Arabia has moved on. The UAE has moved on. Egypt and Turkey have moved on. Iran never cared in the first place. India has moved on, and China has never played the game. Africa is moving on at lightning speed, getting rid of everyone. South America is pushing American influence out of its own politics. The unipolar world is a relic, and the only people that haven't accepted it are the West's political, military-industrial complex class. And they just haven't processed this loss, including the old Hillary Clinton. It's crazy. Western politicians, desperate to maintain the narrative, insist also that Russia's concerns in Ukraine are illegitimate, irrational, or imperialistic. Nobody buys that. The global South doesn't buy that. The only people who believe it are the ones who built their careers on pretending that NATO expansion was a harmless act of goodwill instead of a geopolitical strategy of containment. It's crazy. Doha revealed this contradiction in real time. While Hillary was talking about defending democracy, the Gulf is thinking about energy corridors, security pacts, economic diversification, AI investment, and multipolar balance. CNN is still pretending that American leadership in these fields is indispensable. But Qatar demonstrated that American leadership is often irrelevant. Western politicians still imagine themselves as referees of global morality, and the rest of the world is forming partnerships based on results and economics, not rhetoric. This is the core truth of the new world. Results. Infrastructure. Not values, not speeches, not slogans, not think tank fantasies, but results. And Trump's policy document really does focus on results. And Trump Jr., his message in Doha also focused on results. Tucker's interview expressed and exposed the lack of results in Western policies. Trump Jr. talking about the corruption in Ukraine as a fact was important. And Putin's interview outlined Russia's results despite sanctions, alleged isolation, and pushing war to its doorstep. India's response shows that nations respect results, not narrative. And Doha has exposed the West's Achilles heel. It no longer delivers results. The West delivers stories like Hillary's, and the world is tired of those stories. So this is why Trump's foreign policy vision resonates with me and globally. You should read it if you haven't. It's not because Trump is universally admired. It's because Trump is a little more predictable. He's transactional, and he's uninterested in ideological crusades. Mostly. I still think what they're doing in Venezuela, he needs to back off of that too. But most nations, most leaders prefer truth, reality. The world doesn't want America as a preacher. It wants America as a negotiator. That's what we want. Russia wants stability. India wants stability. Gulf, Africa, China all want stability. The only bloc that seems to thrive on instability is the one that claims to be defending global order. NATO and company. Yep. Putin's final message in his interview in India wasn't spoken explicitly, but it was unmistakable what he has said. Russia is going to survive. Russia will adapt. Russia is going to win where it has to win. And Russia will build alliances with those who choose sovereignty over submission. India chose sovereignty. Qatar chose sovereignty. Much of the world is choosing its own sovereignty. And the more nations that choose sovereignty, the weaker the Western narrative becomes. The world isn't collapsing. Don't be scared over this. It's reorganizing. And nations doing the reorganizing are not in Brussels or Washington. They're in Moscow, Delhi, Doha, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Beijing, Pretoria, and Brasilia. The future belongs to energy producers, infrastructure and manufacturing giants, technological innovators, and civilizational states, not those who think moral lectures about LGBTQ++, add some more. They don't. These moral lectures don't replace competence. Doha, Trump's doctrine, Putin's interview, and India's reception of Putin all tell the same story. The global center of gravity has moved on. Those who accept it are going to thrive. Those who deny it are going to fade. And nothing captures this shift more clearly than the contrast between how the West discusses Russia and how India, the Gulf, and Asia actually view Russia. In the West, Russia is portrayed as a declining, isolated, unpredictable aggressor clinging to past Soviet glory. But in the real world, the world that buys energy, builds infrastructure, and invests in future industry, Russia is viewed as a stable, necessary, resource-rich power that has proven resilient under pressure, capable of long-term planning. Unlike the West, we don't plan long-term because we change direction every 4 years. Western politicians despise Putin because of this, But they cannot change the simple fact that Russia is indispensable to global energy, global security, and global balance. So when Putin speaks, nations listen not only because they admire him personally, but because they recognize that Russia's strategic interests are clear, are consistent, and based on principles that they themselves understand. Sovereignty, security, stability, non-interference, and a respect for civilizational identity. But when Western leaders speak, nations hear a demand for alignment. Join us, be like us, join our definition of democracy. They don't hear a proposal for cooperation. They hear conditions, not partnerships. They hear warnings, not opportunities. And the difference is profound. That difference is why the West has lost influence over the global South. The global South is no longer afraid of Western disapproval. They have options. They no longer depend on Western financial institution. They have options. They no longer rely on Western security guarantees. They have options. They no longer trust Western narratives because they do have options. They no longer accept how the West defines their legitimacy. They're creating their own definition. They're aligning with geographic realities, culture, economies, and history, not with the fantasies put out by Washington think tanks. Trump's doctrine, if you read it, is more compatible with this new world than anything produced by Biden or Clinton, anyone like that. Trump is not promising to reshape the world as America. He's promising to reshape America into a nation capable of competing in the world that actually exists. I liked it. It was a good document. This is why Trump's foreign policy approach, stripped of the media hysteria, is deeply pragmatic. He doesn't want America to dominate through ideology. He wants America to succeed through strength. Nations respect strength. They recoil and dislike moral arrogance. What we saw in Doha and what Putin articulated from India is that the future belongs to nations that understand themselves. Russia understands itself. India understands itself. Qatar, China, Saudi Arabia, UAE understand themselves more clearly today than they did a decade ago. But the U.S. and the Europe seem confused about who they are. They swing between moral crusades and political chaos, between interventionism and isolation, between preaching democracy and eroding their own domestic institution. This confusion makes the West unpredictable in the very worst way. Not unpredictable like a rising power challenging the status quo. Unpredictable like a declining empire lashing out in frustration. The world no longer adjusts itself around instability. It works around it. The workarounds are amazing. The brilliance of Doha 2025 wasn't that it produced new treaties, grand speeches. It was that it exposed, for anyone willing to see it, how the world has changed. A decade ago, the U.S. could have forced Qatar to deny Tucker's revelations or pressured Doha to exclude Trump-aligned speakers. Today, it cannot. A decade ago, Hillary Clinton could have lectured the Gulf and expected applause. Today, she got polite silence. A decade ago, the West could have pressured India to distance itself from Russia. Today, India responds by doubling down on further cooperation with Russia. The world is not anti-American. The world is anti-imperial. The world is anti-hypocrisy. The world is anti-lecture. The world wants partnerships, not patrons, and Trump's foreign policy doctrine, intentional or not, fits the global preference. The unipolar world is over. The multipolar world has begun. Nations prepared to accept this are going to lead the 21st century. Russia is prepared. India is prepared. The Gulf is prepared. Much of the world is prepared. The future isn't ideological, it's civilizational. Depends on infrastructure. In closing, one thing is absolutely certain. The world will not go backward, not after Doha, not after Putin in India, not after everything the West has revealed about itself in Ukraine and Gaza. The global order has changed permanently, and the truth tastes better when you stop pretending otherwise. And here on International Flavor, the truth just tastes better. I'm very glad you were with me today. Thanks for joining. Join us every day at International Flavor, 7:30 to 9 a.m. on damradio.com/live. Listen to every show as a podcast later at internationalflavor.com. Have a big week ahead on Damn Radio. Check out the schedule at damradio.com/schedule. Thanks for being here.